Good evening, everyone. My name's Sarah McDougall. I'm Director of Scholarship at Ben-Uri Gallery and Museum, and I'm delighted to be with you tonight for the first of our series of talks surrounding the exhibition on Lancelot Ribeiro, Heads in and Out of Our Time, which has been co-curated with Marsha Ribeiro, the artist's daughter, who is joining us tonight. We are recording, so if I could ask everyone to please turn off your cameras and to keep yourselves muted throughout, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. And we couldn't be in better hands tonight because Marsha, both personally and professionally, is an absolute expert on her father's work and has prepared a really beautiful talk for us this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Marsha. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes. I'm going to operate her slides. And then at the end, we will have hopefully a lively Q&A session. And we look forward to rejoining you all then. So over to you, Marsha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you also for the invitation to speak this evening. I'm delighted to be speaking at this event where we have this wonderful exhibition on. So I thought maybe I would just outline my approach really with these slides. Really, I've pulled together my father's story from childhood tales that he told me, and also his rich archival collection, a collection really which isn't just where his own voice comes through, but it's the voices of our family, friends, people who've known us. And I guess it's also what I wanted to share with you this evening is my quest to understand his life and to write his story. So I thought I'll share with you some of the letters from the archive, because they seem to reflect every emotion possible, from joy, excitement, sadness, loss, but there are also really touching moments where you have the voices of parents scolding my teenage father, or the dialogue between the two artist brothers. And then I've brought a few images into my slides, which are miniature photographs that my father had kept, and they're so small that they could fit in the palm of your hand. And many of these he annotated as if I think a message that he wanted his story told. So without further ado, Sarah, could I have the next slide, please? Okay. So I wanted to really set the scene with this wonderful photograph that my father took in 1968, and it's from the ancestral home in Goa, a place called Azusi. So my father, Lancelot Ribeiro, was born in 1933 in Bombay, and it was a Bombay still under the British Empire. But our family's ancestral roots were from Goa, and it was old Portuguese Goa. So that was important in terms of my father's artistic consciousness, really, because Goa was uniquely Portuguese in every way, in language, in faith, in customs and traditions. And I wanted to share with you how the visual beauty of the landscape really cast a spell on my father. So this is something he wrote. Arriving in Goa from Bombay by air is just 40 minutes, but as these minutes go by, the change in the landscape is staggering. The choked barrenness of the first 35 minutes give the feeling that whatever vegetation there is blisters and turns to the color of ash. And then, as if in the 36th minute, you see Goa bursting from the lip of the Arabian Sea. The intense light from a string of beaches, white, gold, and pale brown, is fringed with green coconut palms and red earth. It was this visual beauty that made the Portuguese hold on to Goa so doggedly. So Sarah, could we have the next slide, please? So given that influence, I have put together two images that I think really reflect his Goan heritage. And he himself said in a lecture about his work in 1972 that among his first influences were the churches and statuary of the Catholic Church. And here I think you can see, sorry, Sarah, can we go to the previous slide? Thank you. So I've picked an image that on the right is a crucifixion, but to me it reflects also the colours of Goa. And it is one of the themes of our exhibition at Ben Uri, someone who was haunted by his past and wanted to reflect that in his work. So his work was very characteristic in terms of portraying haunting images of Christ, of cardinals, of monks. And we have a wonderful piece in the exhibition which has Christ with his stigmata wounds. But this heritage was also part of my childhood. Around our house, we had ivories of saints and apostles. There were wood carvings on our shelves. So it was those memories from home that I really associated with him. Now, Sarah, can we have the next slide? So a stormy childhood is really how my father described his childhood. So the next set of slides bring out some of those archival images from our photograph album. Sarah, can we move down? Thank you. So these are some of those miniature shots that I mentioned from the album. So my father was born on the 28th of November 1933 and christened with the full Portuguese name Bellarmino Lancelot José Ribeiro. And his baptism certificate is entirely in Portuguese. And he is pictured here with his mother on the right, Lily, who was a milliner and tailor. And he always remembered her as a dynamic figure. And I knew as a child that she had suffered unspeakable trauma. She had lost her first husband when she was only 23. And then she lost a daughter, Zamira, aged 2.5, to diphtheria. And then, as if that wasn't enough, her son came down with smallpox and was on the verge of death. And that son was my father's half-brother, the well-known painter, Francis Newton Sousa. And I picked out perhaps a clue as to why there were two artist sons in that family. And this is something my grandmother wrote to my father when he was a teenager. He had been sent, and I will talk about this in a moment, but he had been sent to study accountancy. And she writes, "Maybe you have a great wish to comply with your father's request, but how about your own mind?" And her letters frequently refer to his most sensitive heart. So behind there was someone, I think, who really encouraged him to follow his heart, essentially. When she remarried in 1933, and that was to my grandfather, John, who was an accountant and more reserved. And just to give you a sense of the contrast, really, between the two, he wrote to my father and said, at one point, he expected to hear of immense progress in his future career, adding, which will give us a gratification, at least in our last days, as we both are nearing our graves. So you can see the contrast within, our family. So Sarah, can we move to the next slide, please? Now, these are this is basically the family home in then Bombay, and on the left is a wonderful 19th century image of the building that my father grew up in. And the reason I've shown it is because that was probably how they remembered it in their childhood. It had this wonderful dome atop and this terrace, which is where many of the family moments were captured in his photographs. On the right is a photograph I took in 2014 when I visited India. And their flat was on the 3rd floor of this building. And it was one which really had a welcoming atmosphere to writers, poets, and artists. And, and I think that really reflected the pulse of Bombay through the 40s and 50s. A city which was vibrant and where the arts, music, and literary scene flourished. So next slide, please, Sarah. Okay, so here this image is of the siblings, and the quote, hand in hand like Hansel and Gretel, is from my father, and it's one which described how he and his sister Marina were when they would walk to school. But in this image, my father is roughly 2 in the first image, standing on the terrace of Hera building. The middle image shows him with his brother Sousa, who everyone calls Sonny, and their sister Marina. And the 2 on the right are my father and Marina. And really, when I was researching for my book, I asked Marina, I said, what was my dad like as a boy? And she described an incident which I think really sums up the spirit that I recognized in him. So when they were walking to school hand in hand, she was in the girls' school and he was in the boys' school, St. Xavier's in Bombay. And Marina told me he did not like school. He used to bunk and go walking. And then he would come to my school just in time so that my mother doesn't come to know that he is not in school and would take me home. He was just roaming about in the city. And I equate that roaming about really with that desire to explore that I saw in him. He had an innate curiosity and delighted in discovering new things. And, I think that he brought into his artwork. So next slide, Sarah. Okay. This sketchbook is from his St. Xavier's days, and we have it on display in the gallery here. And I wanted to just show you these the book actually has a number of heads and townscapes, but I identified these 3 images really because it's telling of the kind of era he grew up in. It was a childhood lived through a turbulent time, through wartime years and troubles that were brewing in India ahead of independence and partition. And on the right, I think that's very telling of the type of art he would have seen, that kind of propagandist art that was common of the era. So we have that on display here in the gallery as well. So Sarah, next slide, please. So as to kind of the background to his childhood, I picked out one where he's with one of his favourite aunts, Auntie Biddy, who was also made my godmother. And you may be able to see part of a Sousa painting on the wall. And this is something, again, that that I refer back to that 1972 lecture where he spoke about those early influences, because the other thing he said was the other, and perhaps the strongest influence, were the paintings of my brother, 10 years senior. And I've often reflected that in the 1930s, the 2 brothers were just boys, and my dad certainly would have witnessed his brother's talent emerge. Also at an impressionable age, when he was entering his teens, he would have seen the artistic circles his brother was mixing in, and he was effectively receiving a schooling in the arts in that way and meeting fellow painters, people like Raza, Hussein and Bakri, who were often in Hira building. There were also others that Marina told me she remembered coming to the house, people who would be instrumental in the lives of both, people like Rudi von Leyden and Emanuel Schlesinger, who were names I heard frequently as my father spoke about these years as well. So Sarah, next slide, please. Now, I put these two images side by side, partly for a reason. The painting on the right, the anguished image, has a real poignancy for me because I was standing next to my dad when I saw that for the first time, and I was completely spellbound and speechless, and I remember saying to no one in particular. My dad was standing beside me, but I remember saying, I want to work in the arts. And he turned to me and he said, that makes me really happy. And then I clarified and I said, no, Dad, I want to work purely with your work. And I think it was such a wonderful moment for us both. It was a realization for me as well that this was something I wanted to do. And I've put it here because that stormy childhood that he refers to really, I think, has its roots when he was taken out of St. Xavier's and put into a remote boarding school, a school called St. Mary's Catholic School, run by a sadistic set of Irish Christian brothers in Rajasthan. And he frequently spoke of the humiliating experiences and sense of isolation he had there. And as I was doing some research about this school for my book, I came across an account from a former pupil who was there broadly at the same time. And he referred to these leather straps that every member of staff carried around with pride. And he had had experience of different boarding schools, but he said his experience at Mount Abu stood out. And it was a way for me to corroborate really what my father had said. So I've got a quote from that alumni site about one of the brothers, Brother Placidus. He had a violent temper. He would remove his strap from his pocket for the least provocation and used it with such vengeance that he used to go red in the face. He did this usually on the younger boys because the bigger boys seemed too threatening for him. Unsurprisingly then, my father said, my beginning as an image maker began in the most inauspicious way, suffered while very young and at the hands of many. So next slide, please, Sarah. Okay. So this part is about his first experience of Britain, and that quote, 6 bitter winters in Britain, was how he once described that stay. So he travelled to Britain by ship, and this is a view of the deck. But if we go to the next slide, you will see I managed to locate this wonderful postcard of the actual ship that he sailed on. Now, his brother had left for Britain in 1949 and wrote home of his impressions of London. And I think that also paved the way for my father to follow. His brother, Sonny, had it was almost a letter that enticed him. And he wrote this wonderful piece that I still think about when he describes the underground of London. So he writes to his younger teenage brother, the underground of London is an amazing feat of engineering. To go underground to the tiny trains called tubes, all one has to do is to stand on a staircase which moves and you reach below or brings you up. They are called escalators. And I absolutely loved that when I saw that. It brought tears to my eyes in the way he was addressing his younger brother. So my dad, who was only 16 at the time, left Bombay in 1950 and travelled aboard this P&O steamship called the Multan arriving in Tilbury. And he recalls in a diary note that sense of fascination of passing shorelines and that kind of sense of curiosity I mentioned, so much so that it lands him in trouble when he wanders off the ship, when it temporarily docks en route. It prompts his mother to write, "What had I warned you about getting down from board the ship at different ports? Had you obeyed my warnings, would you have put us in such a furnace without any news?" So all I can guess from that is either he had got lost. I knew he'd lost some items, but it was that spirit, that curiosity that frequently got him in trouble even years later. So next slide, please. So when I was trying to write about this period, all I had initially to look at was a fairly cryptic sentence that said, "Came to Britain to study accountancy, abandoned it soon after." In actual fact, those years in Britain were really crucial to nurturing that creative, that artistic side, and that poetic side that now was beginning to come out. He was staying with his brother and his brother's wife, Maria, and their daughter Shelley in Chalk Farm in Chalcot Square. And he often referred to that time as our lives and contacts were an open book intertwined at Chalcot Square. As to accountancy, he frequently would tell people, "I could not bear it, I hated it." And in fact, he was miserable. But he was starting to be pulled by that artistic impulse. He was taking up life drawing classes at St. Martin's School of Art. And being in Britain suddenly opened up the continent, and he was now able to travel. And Paris was a real pull for him. One quote I have, he described, "Paris still stays with me. I can remember that I did 11 trips before my 18th birthday." And what was one of my, a surprise to me is that I discovered this fairly late after he had passed, this kind of brown box that you can see in the lower left-hand side of this slide. It was nondescript. It was a brown box that you could hold in your hand. And I opened it a few years after my father had passed and realized he'd studied jewelry making and drawn these wonderful little designs that actually that were perhaps intended for brooches or for necklaces. So it was a real insight into those years. Can we go to the next slide, Sarah? So that path that he was now being pulled towards suddenly came to an abrupt halt when he was captured by 2 military police and placed in the RAF. National service conscription was in force at the time, and he was made to do his service out in West Kirby and in Dumfries in Scotland. And when he leaves, his brother writes again, "My dear Lancey, your clothes and things came in today. I received it with a mixed feeling of delight and some inexplicable sadness. They were the clothes I saw you go in, and now they've returned empty, as it were. But the overcoat I shall wear." My father got compassionate leave just in time because the Suez Crisis was just beginning to brew. And in 1955, he returned to India. Sarah, next slide, please. So this wonderful king we have on display at Ben-Uri as well. And promise and power is the theme of the quotes that came out at that time. So Sarah, can we move on? So my father's story really as an artist wouldn't be complete if I don't mention his poetry. His mother referred to him as having the most sensitive soul, and the reviews noted the sadness, the melancholy, the kind of wanting to convey a literary message really came through in his artwork. And I put on this slide a piece that he dedicated to my mother. And that portrait, my mum actually recalled him painting. She said it was done from a miniature 10 by 10 centimeter photograph, and he kept on glancing up at her, and she said, I was getting impatient, it was taking so long. She was busy, I think, around the house, and she didn't, I think it was part of the kind of sense that she hadn't kind of grasped the power of I guess, that hadn't really grasped what it would be like living as the wife of an artist at that point. So we've got that wonderful portrait of my mother in the gallery as well. So Sarah, please, next slide. This gives you an idea of the kind of images that he had painted early on. He always described his move to painting as happening accidentally when he was invited out hunting. And he declined, but he went to the hardware store with his companion, and he said, I was amazed. Instead of buying ammunition, I bought a load of paint colours. And it was at this point that his path crossed with Rudy von Leyden again, the Times of India art critic, who spent an hour looking at his paintings and said that he must have a show. He was told to see a curator at a gallery at the Taj, and my dad said, I took 3 paintings, and by the time I got back to my room, I got an excited message saying that my paintings had been sold within the space of half an hour. Excuse me. Sarah, next slide, please. And this is one of those reviews that we've got on display at the gallery as well. In the corner of this review is one entitled The Colonialist, very typical of works where he was showing works of tyrants, and he was painting works of tyrants and warlords and archetypes. So what is particularly moving about this piece for me as well is that that's how my mother remembers him looking, and he's standing in front of the mural he was commissioned to paint for Tata. Sarah, please, next slide. So I know this may be difficult to read, but it's a letter from someone who became a patron to him, Dr. Homi Bhabha, who wrote this letter to Indu, who he called, and that's Indira Gandhi, describing how he thought, my father was someone who had great promise, and he mentions how they had acquired a number of pieces from him. My dad always described his meeting with Homi Bhabha as, always with a sense of astonishment, actually, whenever he spoke about him. And he wrote to a friend, I had only just begun painting, which came about by pure accident, and I found it difficult to come to terms with the immediacy of success, which was meteoric. My meeting Homi Bhabha, the scientist, was incredible. But this was also a period that, despite what seemed to be a kind of the prospects of promise and success, he was showing this kind of self-destructiveness that we saw in him as a family. And even as an older man, he looked back and tried to, I suppose, understand why he'd made some of the decisions he'd made. And he put it down to wanting to endure a life of creative suffering. So he turned down the chance to get the Rockefeller Foundation grant. He didn't follow up when he was nominated for the All India Gold Medal, and he turned down sometimes, offers offers that came to buy his work, essentially. But I think what really hit him the most was the premature loss of Homi Bhabha when he was killed in a 1966 air crash. And my dad said he left an incredible and very lasting impression. My feeling is it affected him psychologically, because every time he spoke about it, it was as if it had just happened. So Sarah, please, next slide. So the next few slides really talk about the chapter where he is experimenting with his work, and it's a frenetic period. So if we could go to the next slide here. Now this is a shot of what was his studio in Belsize Park Gardens, and it's one I love particularly because it's that quality of light that I remember. It's the room I grew up in, and it was much less organized when I was a toddler running around in that room. But from that was a variety of work that emerged, and just to mention a few, there were ceramics, there were sculptures, there were surreal drawings, and there were graphics. And if we go to the next slide, it was also a period where he was exhibiting extensively, and at a number of local Hampstead galleries, the Everyman Foyer Gallery, the Mount Gallery, and the New End Gallery. And in fact, I was looking through a review for the Everyman Foyer Gallery, which was in 1965, and he's quoted as saying, "I'm really at my happiest when painting portraits." He was also exhibiting at a number of West End galleries like the Crane Coleman Gallery, the John Whibley Gallery, and the Piccadilly Gallery, and would talk about Nicholas Treadwell's mobile bus, which took art around into the suburbs of the UK. So it was a busy time, and he was finding that particularly his small works and his small landscapes were being bought up. So he needed to produce at speed. And I think that was the catalyst for his search for a new medium, which we'll say something about in a moment. So next slide, please. Now this wonderful photograph is taken in a house in Golders Green, and it's a group of young Indian painters who formed the Indian Painters Collective. And I don't want to say too much about that here because we're doing a separate session on that, but I'm delighted to say that one of the young painters there in the white shirt, Mali, will be joining us on a future with a future event. And I have really learned so much about the history of the collectives through talking to these painters. My dad is on the left of this image here in a black suit. So yeah, more on that one. Sarah, please, next slide. Here he is at one of the shows that the collectives managed to put on. It's 6 Indian painters, and it was held at India House. And the work, which is obscured, cityscape behind him, I'm delighted to say, currently is on view at Tate Britain. And a review really of my dad's work at that time really struck me. So this is from the Arts Review in 1964, where the reviewer said, "The most unaffected by the fashionable tendencies and the most interesting is Lancelot Ribeiro." And I think it was that wanting to reinvent himself, not wanting to follow fashions, that really struck me as I looked through his work. Can we go to next slide, please? Now, Beastly and Beautiful is on display as well at Ben-Uri, and the alternative titles that my father gave this work were Beat Poet or The Poet as well. So he had different ideas, and I love this because now suddenly, compared to his earlier work, there's a softer touch to it and a lyricism that enters this new chapter of Heads. he's also sourcing materials here that weren't easy to find at that time, and there are shades of pink in the background. And this is really characteristic of how he's experimenting with oils and a new medium called polyvinyl acetate. And we've engaged someone who's written a beautiful piece for the catalogue, who looks at the chemistry and science of that paint. So I know that will be made available in due course. But if we can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to share something that is entirely different, but again on display, because this really starts to kind of embody a playful aspect that enters my father's work. And I'd urge you to come and have a look at it in the gallery, because he has hidden his name and date in this piece of work. And I only realized this a few months ago myself, so please do see if you can come and find it. So next slide, please. So I brought this fairly modest catalogue and wanted to share it with you, because it actually hides a really interesting story that I'm hoping to unravel over the next year or so. This was an exhibition called The Arts of India, and it was at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne in 1966. And the whole of Eastbourne pretty much came to a standstill when this exhibition was on, because they had the High Commissioner and the Mayor coming and visiting, and it was a big deal. And the archive had lain hidden for decades, and I only discovered it about a year ago with the curator there. So we wanted to tell the story about this show, but it was an ambitious event because it was showcasing the arts of India, which one commentator said, an exhibition the likes of which may never be seen again in our lifetime. And someone else picked up, Lancelot Ribeiro, in his expressionist works, seems concerned to put across some literary message. And that always makes me think of him as the poet and the painter. So next slide, please. So on a personal note, this wonderful photograph, it was taken a couple of years before my father's brother, Sousa, left for the United States in 1967. But their dialogue would continue over decades. So next slide. So again, just to show you, and the next few slides are really more visual, but I wanted to give you a sense of the variety of work and how he was trying to play with his medium. So this is a new phase of abstraction and tantric works. And so if we can go to the next slide. This work, I think if it was on a wall, no one would imagine it was a Ribeiro. I mean, I grew up with this painting, and I would sit there thinking, how with that limited color palette, how did he produce something so precise? And I think, just to give you a clue as to his artistic philosophy, he once wrote something about his heads. He felt, I had fully achieved what I first set out to do in a rather tentative way. Having finally arrived at a kind of faceless, self-effacing form, I could go on endlessly to produce painting after painting, interesting perhaps, but somewhat meaningless and self-plagiarizing. And I think this is how, I would describe him. He was always redefining himself, and he was letting his imagination run wherever it wanted to go. And he had that ability to control his medium. So next slide. These are two works that are called tantric works, and I put them up because he described them as basically going back to his Indian roots, and it's these works that have been kind of analysed under the microscope effectively, because Patricia Smithen, who I mentioned, has been looking at his materials, really looked at the chemistry of the paint here. And I just wanted to share some images with you in the next slide. of close-ups. And I think really, this is what this, for me, I guess when I look at his work, I try and think what has been the kind of the source of inspiration. And I think, you look at that and you can see someone just having sheer joy with his materials and the artistic effects that they create. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in the 1970s, I've actually put up a slide where Marley appears again on the right, and my father is there, and I'm there actually at the age of 8, and I vaguely remember this occasion. And in the 1970s, the exposure for South Asian arts was there were a number of initiatives and exhibitions really casting a spotlight on South Asian art and the contributions of its artists. And I've documented a number of different initiatives with the support of the Commonwealth Institute, with India House, that are really highlighting the music and the arts of India. You had events at the Brighton Festival in 1973. You had European conferences on modern South Asian studies at the University of Sussex. And you had events that the collectives were still putting on, exhibitions and evenings, such as 4 leading Indian painters at India House. Plus, the artists themselves were having their individual solo exhibitions and other group shows. So it was a chaotic time. When I look at my father's archive, I can just see how much was going on. And in the next slide, artistically, my father was still working at reinventing his style. And I picked out, actually, I was at the National History Museum a few months ago, and I spotted this little... and it was a tiny sample of geological rock from southern Australia, and I thought, that reminds me of my father's work. And these works now were inspired by his travels to the US and travels to the Eastern Seaboard. And it was, again, how he sought to work with his medium to convey effects on the canvas. And it was someone who, I think for me, it also reflects someone who's taken by scenery, taken by landscape, and wants to convey that artistically. So if we go into the next slide, this was a period where my father was focused on landscapes. And it had its ups and downs, but he had his first proper retrospective at the Leicester Newark Museum. And I wanted to share with you something that really brought him joy. Can we have a look at the next slide? So this is just a snapshot, but I think it really gives you a sense of that reinvention, that kind of sense of wanting to work his medium. And these are some watercolors that one of his closest supporters said that he would show at dinner parties and bring out almost as if they were 18th century curiosities. And my father said, I did not attach any seriousness to them until recently, when they appeared to have become my only mode of functioning. They gave me a lot of joy, were extremely relaxing and perhaps levitational. I've never enjoyed doing any of my other work, which has always been compulsive. And what really interests me with these works is that he was actually keeping them quite close to his heart, but showing them at some of the private house showings with people who actually the Ben-Uri Gallery have had a relationship with. And one was Henny Henler, who lived in St. John's Wood. The other was Carol Conrich in West Hampstead. And when I spoke to David here about it, he shared with me his memories of the two. And he said Henny had created her own career around art in particular Jewish artists, but also artists who caught her critical eye. Carol was a cultural vulture in London in much the same vein. Both were fine people with a good heart and soul. So if we move to the next slide, please. So that kind of finding joy was really important to my father, because it was actually a decade which was which was full of personal hurdles and upheavals for him. In the 1980s, he had problems, domestic problems at home. He suffered a racist attack in 1985. He had a heart attack in 1987. He had professional disappointments. His show in Leicester was supposed to tour, but the plans for touring fell through. And it did tour actually to nearby Swiss Cottage, but one of his paintings was vandalized. And then to cap it off, he was excluded from the other story at the Hayward Gallery. And I've included this quote from his brother who wrote, at first I was reluctant to be associated or classed with non-white artists on the principle that art is art, whatever the color of the artist. I'm writing to you because I had suggested to them to include you. And I thought I wanted to show that because it was, again, the brothers communicating. But on a positive note, and in my closing slides, please, Sarah, can we go to the next slide? I'm delighted that we are showcasing this exhibition with this work in the front of the museum at Ben-Uri. And this was my father's dream, to have an exhibition heads in and out of our time. And so it has become my dream. And if we can move to the next slide. Now, these images really gave him a kind of sense of revival, really, because he was now exhibiting in Germany, and his heads and figures took on a very different feel. But they still had those touches, that were characteristically Ribeiro, geological touches across the canvases and townscapes at the base of the image. And this is a time he is writing again. So I think, it was really spirit for food for his soul, really. Next slide, please, Sarah. We have this wonderful image which he took and displayed in India in 1998. And this was really where heads again became a kind of an obsession. And he was talking about his wish to have this exhibition. And one of the things I've noticed, which I think, really moves me, is that now he brings his poetry into his work, and sometimes that's in the titles. So this one was called The Flowering of Man. And the next one, please, Sarah. This one here really shows again that experimental approach, and he's made his own canvas, really, although it's on paper. He has actually affixed miniature pieces of paper together and relied on playing with his medium in each of those grids that you can see on this image. And I think if we go to the next slide, this was really, this beautiful shot was taken of him in Delhi, where he writes, for some strange reason, within the last 18 months or so, I began writing. So I think that was a really lovely turning point for him. And I wanted to, my penultimate slide, if we go to the next one, I think reminds me of the two brothers. It was the last painting he exhibited before he passed away at the British Art Fair. And he wrote to his sister Marina. Sonny had passed away by this point in 2002. And my father wrote, I miss Sonny very much. And that's Susan. So I miss Sonny very much, despite our usual fights and arguments. I remember during one of them, Uncle Cyril walked in, as he often did. His first words were, why are you two brothers fighting? Sonny retorted, because we are Shakespearean brothers. My attitude to him was sheer love and hate. I feel sure he felt the same towards me. And the final slide, please. So I promised to bring you my father's voice. So Sarah, would you play? This is just 30 seconds, but...
Run, rabbit, run, run, run. Don't let the farmer's gun, gun, gun. Bang, bang, bang goes the farmer's gun. Run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, 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 run. Run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, 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 run. Don't let the farmer's gun, gun, gun. Bang, bang, bang goes the farmer's gun. Run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run, run, run.
Thank you, Sarah. And over to you.
Thank you, Marsha. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just having trouble getting my picture up. That was absolutely lovely. I was a bit spellbound there at the end, seeing the beautiful photo and hearing the voice. So as I get my video back on gradually, I'm sure that people will want to ask us questions. But perhaps I can just kick off while everyone's getting ready, and I hope they will be putting them into the chat function. And obviously it's such a rich presentation that you gave us this evening, and so much really to unpick, a lot of which I know, as we said, we'll hear about in further talks in more detail. But you really took us on that whirlwind tour through all those influences, from Goa, the church, Susa, and so forth. I wonder if you feel that your father felt he had a settled period, a period that meant the most to him.
I don't know if I could use the word settled in a sense, because he was, we had an exhibition a few years ago, and we called it Restless Ribeiro, and that really was his nature. I could say actually though, having, if I reflect on that, when I referred to that quote and he spoke about his watercolors being levitational and him finding joy, perhaps it was that, I think that provided him with calm. It was almost kind of, he said it was almost therapy for him in a way, and so I suppose out of all of that, that took him away from otherwise that compulsive nature that is, he was well known for, if that makes sense.
Yes, it very much does. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting my own image to appear, but let us continue the conversation. Another thing that really struck me was really how you spoke about that turbulent childhood, and
Yeah.
clearly he went through a great deal, both at school with what happened to him, that violent background. Of course, we all hear those kind of stories now. But also just living through the war itself, and then independence in India and all the difficulties, the horrors that unfolded with partition. I wonder if that's something he spoke about with you.
Yes, he did. I mean, when I reflect, sometimes it was passing snippets that he would, that would come out, and he would, for instance, talk, about what it was like in Bombay before the Troubles, effectively. And when I looked at those images of hero building, I was reminded of something he said, and even his sister said, that it was a time that they were that that. It was a place where communities had lived side by side, and I wish I'd asked him, to be honest. I wish I'd said, Dad, what was it actually like for you during during those years. But I was young, I didn't think to ask. So the way I kind of have tried to piece that together is I've asked some of my family and some of his friends what it was like for them. I've kind of tried to get a sense of what Bombay was like during those turbulent years. But I think it's one of those reasons why that troubled past, that history comes out in so much of his artwork. That kind of what one of his reviewers calls the genesis of evil.
Yes, and of course that's one of the themes that we deal with in the show. There was the wonderful quote which you gave us a bit of at the beginning about how he painted colonialists, kings, tyrants, thugs and women, something along those lines. I always am amused that luckily the women are excluded from that very power-oriented.
Yeah.
And we have one of the women behind you, of course, Pink Queen, standing big and proud behind you. I don't want to dominate the chat. I don't know if anybody would like to tap anything in.
Can I add something, Sarah, just for a moment? Because what I meant to also say, but I was aware of time, is that the later works often refer to kind of his sense of, I guess, frustration at the state of mankind and the kind of sense of destruction and devastation that we see in the world. And so he was very mindful of political turmoil, and I think that certainly came out in a lot of his later works.
Thank you. Yes, and yes, maybe you just would like to close by telling us a little bit about those three fantastic works we can see behind you. Very fittingly, we have just half of the head of Paranoid. Then we have the full Pink Queen, and then we have the untitled work. Thank you, with the green background there. And they're such a powerful trio. So perhaps you just tell us a little bit about those as we're looking at them.
Okay, so these are, so I think these really fall into a period where he's concentrating on these pretty much faceless heads, or kind of playfulness with these heads. And, I certainly find the kind of the head on the green background, I find it quite poetic and lyrical, and perhaps that's because of the fluidity of the paint. And I discovered in conversations with conservationists we worked with that it's purely PVA, or polyvinyl acetate. There's no trace of oil in there. And he's produced these kind of, almost this kind of three-dimensionality to the work, which really contrasts with the Pink Queen directly behind me. And Sarah, I know you were saying, and I agree with you, it's almost like a playing card in its flatness. And when you look close at it, I mean, there is a softness to it which is very contrasting to the male heads. And as you said, that's something in terms of his treatment of female figures. Paranoid as well. Now, sometimes I look at that and I think I see one head, and sometimes I see two heads in kind of in profile, two faces in profile. And there is a lot of underpainting that's visible when you look at that work. And I think that didn't bother him. He kind of knew how to use his medium, and he would often repaint work to bring out certain effects. But all three are beautiful examples of that experimental period, because what he is doing there is he's working with his own medium that he had perfected by that point. So he had sourced this colorless solution, the polyvinyl acetate, from manufacturing companies in the 60s, and infused that with these high-strength dyes that only came in miniature sample bottles and were largely available for the industrial and commercial sectors. So they weren't mainstream products. And even then, he is tailoring these to create the kind of medium that produce the effects he wants. So for me, these three works have a number of layers to them.
Yes, and they're sort of experimental both with materials and motif, really. And I should explain as well that in the way we've realized the concept of your father's title, Heads In and Out of Our Time, we've looked specifically at two principal decades, the 60s and 90s, which were both incredibly innovative. And you've just shown us those three marvelous works from the 60s. So I think we're coming to the end of our time. I'm very reluctant to close the session, but I know that you've had, the burden of speaking for so long. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much, Marsha, and to let everybody know that we have a real treat next week, because we actually have a double event. And we've decided, after much discussion, to run it over 2 nights. So it's really one event, but it's in 2 parts. The first part will go out online on the 5th, and that will be Marsha giving us another marvelous presentation, which will be about the formation and the background of the Indian Art Collective. And then on the 6th, we have a live streamed event from the gallery with Marsha, with Marley, who's been mentioned a few times this evening and who has just turned 90, and will be greatly honoured to have him with us as well, and a small invited audience. And we will there be discussing the collective and its importance. And then the week after that, we will have Simon Lake, formerly the curator at Leicester, which Marsha mentioned, and he will be giving us a talk about Ribeiro as an Indian expressionist. So I'll just read out this little comment here from Tana, who would like to thank you very much for your insightful talk. We have another comment thanking you for the very interesting, informative discussion, talk rather. And I think those are no doubt typical of how much everyone's enjoyed this evening. So thank you once again, Marsha. We will let you go now, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again next week. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks also from Gemma and Flo, who found it an inspirational journey, as indeed it was. Thank you, Marsha, and good night, everybody.
Good night.